Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Dance Physio Podcast. This is the second episode in little mini series on flexibility for dancers. So if you haven't listened to episode 11 yet, I encourage you to go back and listen to that one. That one is all about the difference between flexibility versus mobility when we're talking about flexibility within the dance population. And today we're going to dive into overstretching. And this is a topic that comes up time and time again in terms of questions about, is overstretching safe? Why is it potentially unsafe? How can we increase flexibility in ways that are maybe more safe than doing a lot of overstretching? So we're going to dive into all of those things today. But like I said, if you haven't listened to episode 11 yet, I encourage you to go back and listen to that one and then come back and finish listening to this episode. So we're going to be sort of continuing on a little bit with that theme of flexibility versus mobility, but looking at it more from a lens of overstretching or sort of more extreme levels of mobility today. So like I said in the previous episode, when I was first talking about flexibility in dancers, the demands of flexibility have increased fairly exponentially within the last few decades for sure, but maybe even less time than that. Like if we even look at dance 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was not as much extreme flexibility or mobility sort of happening within the dance world. And we see this especially commonly within the competition dance world, where we see these really, really extreme levels of flexibility. And this sort of desire among dancers, but also dance educators and just the industry as a whole to be able to achieve higher or more extreme levels of mobility within our dance populations. And with that has come maybe more extreme stretching practices. So I'm sure all of you guys are familiar with seeing, social media posts or things circulating with dancers doing all sorts of kind of extreme stretching routines. Oftentimes people are using like straps or belts or suspending themselves between kind of chairs to get into over-splits positions, using yoga blocks, all sorts of things. And some of this stuff doesn't just come from the dance world. Like there's certainly lots that circulates on social media that comes from maybe more of like a gymnastics background or a circus background or rhythmic gymnastics and things like that. So it's not only happening within the dance world, but it certainly crossed over into the dance world. And we're seeing a lot of these types of things being posted. And unfortunately, especially when it comes to social media, a lot of these posts get a lot of attention. And if you ever read through the comment section on some of these posts, there's a lot of kind of praise and accolades that happens for, dancers being able to showcase really extreme levels of oversplits or these types of things. There's often comments of people raising concerns about the safety of the stretches, or some of the videos are like horrendous where the dancers are literally in tears and being forced into these positions. And those ones maybe get a little bit more negative media. But overall, there's a lot of glorification and praise that's happening within social media when we see these extreme levels of flexibility or mobility. And recently, I'm trying to think when, but it was a few months ago, there was a large social media account, a well-respected social media account that kind of did what they were calling a conditioning challenge, I believe. And so they were asking people to submit videos, and a lot of what was being submitted was a lot of unsafe stretching practices involving a lot of kind of overstretching and things we wouldn't consider to be sort of safe stretching practices. And they were reposting these videos and then, of course, getting all sorts of like positive feedback and accolades, and people within the dance medicine and science kind of field or that realm of the dance world, we all spoke out pretty quickly about it to sort of call out that account and raise the alarms about why it was so problematic. And fortunately, they did take down some of the offending posts, and there was a little bit of dialogue that happened in terms of recognizing why maybe some of that content was not appropriate for them to be posting. But with that came lots of questions of people sort of asking, well, is overstretching really that bad? Or why is it problematic? Or things like that. And so it's probably one of the number one questions I get as it relates to flexibility or mobility in dancers from parents and from dance teachers, as well as from dancers. Although, to be quite honest, I don't get the question from dancers themselves nearly as much. It's often parents who are potentially concerned, and then teachers who are wondering, if it's an appropriate thing for them to be doing within their class or that type of thing. So we are going to dive into all things overstretching today and just talk about why it may or may not be a good idea. So that sort of is the question, is overstretching really that bad? And the answer is maybe a little tiny bit nuanced, but realistically the answer is yes. It's probably not a safe choice for the vast majority of dancers. So it's not something we necessarily want to be perpetuating within the dance industry, and especially within like a dance class setting and things like that. And to understand why it is problematic, we need to understand the anatomy a little bit more. And that's why I think it's important for you to listen to episode 11, where we differentiate between flexibility versus mobility, because I dive into a little bit of like anatomy type stuff in there as well. But in order for us to understand why it's problematic, we need to understand what it is we're trying to achieve when we're trying to achieve higher levels of mobility. And so just as a little tiny bit of a recap, when we are stretching muscular tissue, we know that muscular tissue is elastic. And so that tissue, when we stretch it, you can think of it a little bit like a rubber band, but when we stretch it, it stretches. And when we allow that muscle to relax, or when it contracts, it shortens again. So you can kind of stretch it and then it will recoil back to its original length. And over time, we can gradually increase the length of muscles, and we can continue to increase that length and gain more flexibility in muscles that way. But it always has that elastic property where it stretches out and then it recoils back, and it has the ability to shorten via contracting the muscle as well. And that's a really important property to remember when we're thinking about sort of flexibility. Connective tissue, on the other hand, and so again, just a recap from the previous episode, connective tissue, we're talking about things like ligaments, we're talking about joint capsules. Those connective tissues are much less elastic. So when we stretch them, or sort of if we stretch them, we're actually tensioning them rather than them stretching like an elastic. I think I used the example last time of them being a little bit more like kind of like a rope. Like you can create tension on them from either end, but they're not going to stretch and recoil the same as a muscle would that has that more elastic property. They actually can stretch out though. So when we are thinking about connective tissues, there's a property in them that we call creep that can happen over time. And so this will happen if we're doing especially a lot of like sustained passive stretching and for longer periods of time. So I didn't get into it on the last episode, but when we are talking about doing sort of stretches or trying to increase mobility, we often talk about keeping those stretches under a certain length of time. And so oftentimes we'll recommend holding a stretch for say 30 seconds or maybe 60 seconds, but we don't want to be holding stretches for super extended periods of time. And we see this within the dance industry. I'm sure all of you have had the experience of doing a wall split or some sort of stretch, and the teacher says, okay, right, I'm going to put a song on and you're going to hold this stretch for the duration of the song or whatever. And so you're holding it for 5 minutes, or some teachers used to use 10 minutes or things like that. These practices are not as common as they used to be, but they do still exist within the dance world. And the problem with doing things for such a sustained length of time is that we start to get into what we call creep in the connective tissue. So we can actually start to stretch out those connective tissues, but those connective tissues do not have the ability to recoil back to their original length like muscular tissue does because of that elastic property. So if we are stretching connective tissue, we are permanently changing the structure of it. We are never going to get it to sort of shorten back down to its previous resting length. And that is where the biggest issue with some of these overstretching techniques comes sort of into play. So I'm going to use oversplits for an example, but I'm sure most of you are familiar with kind of that oversplit position, and it involves a dancer usually elevating the front leg, but sometimes front and back legs, and sometimes you'll see them elevated on, say, yoga blocks or things like that. In more extreme cases, we might have a dancer who has their legs up on like a chair or something. And generally with these overstretching practices, what's happening is we're sort of hanging, or we're often unsupported within these positions. And so when we look at a dancer in these positions, usually their hips and pelvis are off the ground and the weight of their body is sort of being suspended between like their front leg and their back leg. And like I said, sometimes only one leg is elevated and sometimes both legs are elevated, but they're sort of unsupported or hanging in this position. And that means that all of their body weight and all of that force is actually going through the connective tissues of the joints that they're hanging off of. So in the case of like an oversplit, a lot of that is coming through the hip joints, although there's a certain amount of force coming through like the knee joints as well. And we'll often actually see people trying to get quote unquote hyperextension in their knees to try and get sort of those more hyperextended lines. And they're often doing sort of more extreme overstretching type stretches to do that as well. So it's not just oversplits that we see overstretching happening in other areas of the body. But in these unsupported positions, we are essentially, I often use the term kind of hanging off of our ligaments, but we are putting huge amounts of force and stress through those connective tissues. And ultimately, often we end up stretching out those connective tissues. And that elongation or stretching out of the connective tissues becomes a permanent change. And this is super problematic, especially in young growing dancers, although arguably it's problematic in all dancers or in all people, because our connective tissue, and especially the joint capsules and the ligaments surrounding the joint, are incredibly important for stability within our joints. They are one of the primary constraints in terms of stability within our joints. And if we stretch out these structures, and in this case permanently stretch out these structures, we lose stability within our joints. And that later on down the road, so over time, will lead to uncontrolled movements happening at the joints. And this can sometimes present as a lot of like clicking or popping or clunking around or things like that. And ultimately, that uncontrolled mobility over time will end up leading to injury. And those injuries can be varied depending on, again, what joint it is and where the instability is coming from. But just the hip joint, because we see this the most with a lot of these like extreme oversplits and things like that, that could potentially lead to impingements within the hip. It could lead to labral tears within the hip. It could lead to, sort of bone spurs or osteophyte deposits. And ultimately, it could lead to early joint degeneration. So things like osteoarthritis within the hip joint. So these are all things that are going to occur later on down the road if we have instability that happens at a joint. And that comes from that uncontrolled movement if we lose some of that stability. So that is why we, within the dance medicine and science community, know that overstretching can be fairly problematic. And the sort of, I don't know if frustrating is the right word, but the part of this it's hard to convey to especially dancers, and I think this is why I don't actually get a lot of dancers themselves asking about this, because the effects aren't immediate. And so it's not as if a dancer is doing an oversplit and then immediately feels the effects of that. In some cases they do, and especially if it's a dancer who maybe doesn't actually have the mobility to be doing kind of overstretching or oversplits type things, but the effects are much more significant later on down the road. And so this is where it becomes a hard kind of sell, if you will, because people want the immediate payoff of the increase in mobility, but aren't necessarily taking into account the long-term consequences of what could potentially be happening from doing a lot of these sort of uncontrolled or really extreme levels of overstretching or oversplits or what have you in through there. So, like I said, it is no surprise that the levels of mobility or the requirements of mobility have increased within the dance industry. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't be working on increasing our flexibility or increasing our mobility, but there are far safer ways to do it than hanging out in a lot of these kind of like overstretch or oversplit sort of positions or using a lot of overstretching. And I'm going to actually, one of the upcoming episodes in this little mini series, we're going to dive into this a whole lot more, but I will just say for right now that really we want to be focusing on more active ways of achieving mobility. And so I'll get into like the definition of all of that and examples and everything in a future episode. But essentially, when we focus on active mobility, we are targeting the flexibility, but also the strength of muscles. So as we're gaining mobility around a joint, so say your hip joint, because we want to do the splits, we're also increasing or gaining strength in that area at the same time, which will ensure that A, we're not causing permanent damage to the connective tissue surrounding that joint, but also that we can control the entire range and movement that we have access to. And so that is going to mitigate some of that instability or uncontrolled movement that can be the result of a lot of these overstretching practices in through there. So I hope that gives you a bit of an understanding of kind of the mechanics behind overstretching and why it can be sort of so problematic. The other question I often get asked in regards to overstretching is, but what about our really mobile dancers? What about the naturally, quote unquote, naturally flexible dancers, the ones who are easily flat in their splits? They're not getting a challenge. They're not feeling a stretch when we're doing kind of more basic stretching within class. And this is a really valid question because oftentimes I think teachers go to overstretching practices because they have these dancers who, you know, the class is all working on their splits and this dancer's just like been flat in their splits since they were 3 years old and they don't feel any stretch anywhere. And so they're just kind of hanging out and the teacher's like, well, okay, we want to challenge them. We want to continue to increase their stretching. And so the question is often, well, it's safe for them, right? Like those dancers, it shouldn't be problematic. And the answer is a lot more nuanced than that because these are the dancers where you actually probably need to be even more cautious with. And not necessarily all the time, but if you have a dancer who's sort of naturally, quote unquote, flexible and can achieve things like the splits and stuff fairly easily, there is a high probability that that dancer is likely hypermobile. And there's different types of hypermobility, and this has been increasing in awareness. And I think there's a lot more people familiar with kind of hypermobility and what it may or may not be. But there's a large subset of people who have hypermobility who it relates to sort of a connective tissue disorder. So you might have heard of something called EDS or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And so we need to be highly suspicious that if we have dancers who mobility seems to come quite naturally to them, that there is the potential that they may have some sort of underlying hypermobility going on. And that means that they are actually already at higher risk of some of those things we were talking about in terms of uncontrolled joint movements. So just because you have a dancer who can naturally get into fairly flexible positions like the splits, for example, does not mean that they can control those movements well. And so with these dancers, although teachers want to be sort of challenging them and continuing to help them improve, where we actually need to be challenging them more is often with the strength component of things. So again, this comes back to active mobility that I'm going to get into more in the next episode, because although they can get into these positions, they often can't control those positions. So an example of that would be your dancer who, say they're doing like a kick or a grand battement, they can whack their leg up really high, get it near their head, they're doing a tilt, whatever it is, and they have huge amounts of like mobility or flexibility to be able to do that. But if we ask them to do that same move in a slow, controlled manner, so say doing it as like a développé, for example, they may not be able to get their leg much above, say, 90 degrees because they lack the strength to be able to control that movement that they have available to them. And so those dancers are arguably maybe at more risk from some of these kind of injury risk factors in terms of having those uncontrolled movements than a dancer who maybe mobility doesn't come quite as naturally. So I know that it's tempting, especially as a teacher, but even if you are a dancer, to really try and continue to improve your mobility because that's the thing that is, maybe your it factor or the thing that kind of sets you apart from other dancers. But really from an injury reduction standpoint and just general health standpoint, we really need to be honing in on making sure that dancers can control all of that movement that they have available to them within those ranges. And oftentimes what we see is a mismatch within that. So generally, I would say, like, especially if you're a teacher, before you start to think, okay, how can I challenge this dancer's mobility? We want to know that the dancer can control all of the mobility they have available to them. If we have dancers, and this does happen periodically, if we have dancers who have good mobility and also have good control of that mobility, and so oftentimes we'll refer to this as active mobility and passive mobility. So passive mobility would be, if you're using momentum or an external force, like say you're using a strap to stretch or things like that. So if they can passively get their leg up high, so again, like example, say you're shouldering your leg and you can get it up really high, and then actively, so when you have to use your own muscles, so if they're doing a développé of that same movement, if those ranges of motion match, so a dancer can control all of the mobility they have available to them, then we can start to think about, okay, how can we work on sort of increasing their mobility, but also the control with the mobility into more extreme ranges of motion. Honestly, in the clinic, I don't see very many dancers whose mobility and sort of active mobility and passive mobility are equal to each other. There's almost always a trade-off where if they have a lot of natural mobility, they often lack in that sort of strength and control component. But like I said, it does happen, and dancers who've worked really hard on their strength and control of those ranges, we can then start to challenge them. But even in those dancers, we want to stay out of these overstretching positions where we're going to be putting a lot of strain through their ligaments and joint capsules and other connective tissues. So with these dancers, there's other kind of positions or exercises or stretches that we'll often use that stay away from those kind of just like hanging off your ligament positions, for lack of a better description. And so things like that, and this is going to be a challenging audio description of this stretch, but I actually have an Instagram video that demonstrates it. So I'll throw that into the show notes so you can see it. But if we have a dancer, so if we think about oversplit, so generally our body's upright and we have either front leg or back leg or both propped up onto something to get into that more than 180 degree split position. Again, we don't like this because we're hanging off of those hip ligaments and creating stress through the connective tissue. But if we want to work on mobility with a dancer into more than an 180 degree split position and they have adequate strength to be able to control that movement, if we flip that dancer over, so we have them on their back instead, and there's various ways we can do this. We can do this with them kind of the one leg hanging off the edge of like a treatment table or a bed or a counter or something, or we can prop their hips up using, say, a yoga block or a foam roller or things like that. We can then work into achieving control through 180 degrees or even greater into a split position, but with there being relatively little stress through those connective tissues, because we don't have their whole body weight hanging off of their ligaments in those positions. So there are ways of achieving, I don't know if I want to use the word extreme, but maybe significant levels of mobility within dancers who it is appropriate for, in a way that is safer and in a way that is more controlled. So I'm by no means saying, okay, overstretching is bad and therefore we just shouldn't be pushing the boundaries of flexibility within dancers. I still think there are ways to improve dancers' mobility and work within what is kind of expected and required within the dance industry in ways that are safer for our dancers and aren't going to risk long-term permanent damage to their connective tissues and to their joint structures. Are the levels of mobility that are expected or required, I don't know if required is even the right word, but expected in the dance industry today, are those going to continue? I don't know. I think there's a bit of that sort of like pendulum that swings back and forth. And right now we seem to be kind of getting to the peak of like, okay, all of these really extreme levels of things. But, there's lots of talk out there in the industry that at what expense have we kind of gone to that extreme level of things? And especially if we look at the competition dance world, we often are seeing maybe a little bit of a loss of like the artistry within dance, because it's become quite sort of trick focused, and that can be like tumbling and things like that, but also these extreme flexibility tricks with, whether it's, tilts or what have you, just kind of this extreme flexibility. So I think we'll see the pendulum swing back, where there's going to be a little bit more of a focus on artistry and maybe not these quite so extreme levels of mobility. But that being said, as it stands right now, there certainly is an expectation for at least a minimum level of flexibility within the dance industry. And I don't think that that's completely unreasonable. And we can get there much, much more safely than maybe some of the practices that are currently being used in terms of a lot of that sort of overstretching and passive kind of sitting into oversplits and things like that. So I hope that has kind of clarified things for people a little bit in terms of why we find overstretching so problematic in terms of the risks that it runs for dancers. And like I said, it's a little bit of a harder sell, and especially if you're a teacher, in terms of educating your dancers on the risks of this, because the effects are not so immediate. And so they may not feel the effects of it immediately, but 10, 20, 30 years down the road, they may actually start to see the effects of damage that they caused when they were in childhood or like adolescence. So it's our job as, adults and role models within the dance industry to really be educating them on the effects of this. And so they understand what the potential risks of it are, even if they're not sort of going to notice the effects straight away. And then also making sure that we are teaching them ways of gaining mobility and flexibility in a way that it's going to be safer for their body. Because I think if we just say, don't do overstretching, it's dangerous, we are doing them a disservice, because they know just from being within the dance industry and seeing dance on stage and being at competitions and things like that, they know that dancers are getting rewarded for being more mobile and being able to do certain things. And so we need to give them tools to be able to continually improve their mobility, but in ways that are safer and more controlled. So, like I said, future episode, I'm going to dive way more into active mobility and sort of what that is and how we implement that into kind of our classes and examples and things like that. But I just felt it was really important to do an episode specifically on overstretching because it's such a huge topic that I get so many questions about, and something that, although a lot of the dance industry knows the risks associated with it, we're still seeing it perpetuated within especially social media, and it is still being kind of glorified to some degree with some of these extreme stretching practices. So I hope that you found that useful, and maybe it's given you a little bit of food for thought in terms of your own stretching or flexibility practices and how maybe you might want to start to change things up if you were using some, overstretching or really kind of sustained stretching practices. And like I said, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next couple of episodes in the Flexibility for Dancers series, because we're going to be going much more into active mobility and how you can use that to safely improve your dancers' mobility. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate everybody who is listening, tuning in, downloading, leaving a rating, leaving reviews. It all means so much to me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, or things you want me to make sure that I cover within the next couple of episodes in this mini series, so things specifically about flexibility for dancers, please reach out. You can DM me at Dance Physio Erika on Instagram or Facebook, or send me an email, and I would be happy to answer those questions on a future podcast. Hope you have a great rest of your day.